am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. We have Beth Brumley back in the house. And today we're actually going to be giving an update on confinement animal laws. Beth, welcome back.
Hi, it's good to see you. It's good to be here.
So Beth, remind our listeners, who are you, where are you, and what do you do?
Of course. My name is Beth Brumley. I'm a senior staff attorney at the National Agricultural Law Center. My research focus down here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, is on legal issues in animal agriculture.
So Beth, I rave about the National Agricultural Law Center to my clients and colleagues. So for those listeners that are unfamiliar with that entity, can you refresh their recollection on exactly what the National Ag Law Center does?
Of course. So we are, as we say, the nation's leading source of agricultural and food law research and information. What that means is we don't represent people like you do, Carrie, but we create resources for people who are interested, who are not necessarily attorneys, but are interested in knowing more about how the law affects different parts of agriculture. We do a lot on our website. That's the primary way that we put these resources up, which is nationalaglawcenter.org. But we also do presentations and these types of things all over the country as well.
So I know that you mentioned the reading rooms in episode 46, but I just want to remind everybody about the reading rooms. Can you maybe give an overview about where to find that on the website and what kind of topics are discovered?
Oh, of course. Those are my favorite part of the website because they're so wonderful at getting you familiar with just a very specific area of law. So if you go to the homepage and on the left-hand side, it says research by topic in the menu box over there. If you click on that, it will take you to our list of like 50 reading rooms. And each reading room is specific to an area of agricultural law. So it's everything from Endangered Species Act to animal welfare to Packers and Stockyards Act or Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, almost anything you can think of. And each of the reading rooms are set up that have resources that talk about that area. So there's an overview article for each of them that gives you a sort of a synopsis of what's happening and why is this important. And then there's statutes and regulations and cases and other kinds of documents that help flesh out more about what that is and why it's important to agriculture, why it's important to law. And we update those every year. And it's a great way for people who either aren't lawyers at all or aren't familiar with that area to sort of get a foundation of knowledge that will help them move along and take that information to wherever they need it. Some folks use it to try to influence policy, to suggest that their state or federal legislatures pass specific types of laws. People use it to get a foundation of understanding things like estate planning. So when they go and talk to an attorney like you, Carrie, they have a foundation and they know what a trust is versus what a will is and what sort of basics of what those things do. And so the really cool thing, or the thing that I think is one of the most important parts, is that our information is not political and it's not meant to advance or suggest changes to policy. Our goal is to say this is what the law is now, and then people can take it and use it in a way that's most helpful to them.
It is phenomenal. So I highly recommend to our listeners to go check that out and peruse around. I know specifically that I've used it for a resource for various reasons. So I just really appreciate that. So Beth, I'm curious, how did you get interested in this area of farm animal confinement law?
I have no idea, really, honestly. So after law school, I came to Arkansas to earn my LLM, or Master of Laws in Agricultural Law. And after I graduated, I was hired on by the center for what was initially supposed to be a 1-year gig. And as I was looking for a topic to write my thesis for my LLM, was when the original California ballot proposal was really hitting the news, and we were starting to see a very strong uptick in these types of proposals being put out in the United States. So I'm like, okay, well, this seems to be sort of this is a thesis that I can do and probably do pretty quickly. And so I did the research for it, and it just sort of ballooned from there. There was a lot of interest in it, and so it just became something that I was the center research person on animal ag.
And since then, these kinds of laws have not gone away. And in fact, we've only seen more of them. So, Beth, since the last time we spoke about this topic, and since episode 46 went out into the podcast here, can you tell us about where we have come from then?
Yeah, of course. So these laws, just as a brief reminder, they are laws that require animals, farm animals, specifically laying hens, pregnant sows, and veal calves, depending on what state you're in, to have a certain amount of space that's given to them. The practices that we're talking about here are things like gestation stalls and battery cages for laying hens. Okay, those were the initial types of ag practices that these laws were meant to address or were meant to attack. So that's what sort of happened across the country over the past decade or so. The one that is most relevant at the moment would be Prop 12. And Prop 12 is a ballot proposal that was passed in California in 2018, and it passed about 63% of the vote. And what Prop 12 did, in effect, was it required that eggs that were produced and sold in California come from cage-free birds. The previous ballot proposal required that they have more living space, but this one eliminated cages altogether. The second part, we required that pork or veal products that are sold in California must come from farms without crates. So if you listened, you heard two different parts. You heard it's a requirement on producers within the state to mandate certain living conditions. And then there's also a requirement on producers outside of the state that are interested in California's market share. So for people in Iowa that want to sell within the state of California, it requires them to make sure that their products are either that their birds are either cage free or that their sows are from non-gestation crate environments.
Wow. So has there been any litigation that has happened since Prop 12 went into effect?
There has. There's been several challenges, but two of them are still pending, are still in the mix. One of them was brought by the Pork Producers Council and American Farm Bureau Federation. And that one is making a challenge based on the Commerce Clause, challenging Prop 12 on Commerce Clause grounds.
So for our listeners that were not tortured with constitutional law, can you talk a little bit about the Interstate Commerce Clause, just the big picture? Don't want to get into the weeds on this.
I know. And when I talk to folks, a lot of times they're scientists or people who just don't have that terrible semester-long memory of what the Commerce Clause is. And so just in brief, what we're looking at is the Constitution requires that if there's a law that affects everybody in the country or more than one state, that it's passed by Congress, that laws that are passed by an individual state legislature should only affect people within the state. So the state of Arkansas isn't going to be passing laws that say, Oklahoma, this is what you have to do. This is what your people have to do. Instead, they're limited. They can just do, this is what you folks in Arkansas are responsible for. And so the argument is that California passed this law that affects people from outside of the state of California. So they're saying, hey, they shouldn't be able to do this. It should be Congress that's responsible for it, if anybody. There are a couple exceptions, a couple sort of quirks in that, just like there is in every kind of law. There's never black and white. And obviously, that's what California is arguing. They are saying that we have a public health reason for passing this law. And because it falls in this public health exception, then we are able to pass the laws, even though it does tangentially affect people from outside of the state.
All right, interesting. So what is the status of that pending or that litigation at this point in time?
Well, at this moment, it's pretty exciting. I know for our listeners, maybe not so exciting, but for ag lawyers who don't usually get to hear this kind of thing. So this case actually lost in the district court. It lost at the Ninth Circuit. National Pork Producers lost at both of those. And so they appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court accepted cert. So what that means is they're going to be hearing this case. They're going to be trying this case or hearing it in fall of this year. So in the starting in the October term.
And that's actually pretty extraordinary because the Supreme Court does not hear that many cases on an annual basis. I mean, sort of the old joke is people are like, I'm going to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, but that's actually almost impossible to do.
Yeah.
So
it's a very small percentage of cases that are being heard. And when you think about cases relevant to agricultural law, it's like this many. There's very tiny.
Exactly. So we'll have to stay tuned and see what happens there with that argument there. So tell me, Beth, I mean, are there any other states that are having similar propositions in the Prop 12 in California?
There is, but let me tell you about the other legal challenge first, because the National Pork Producers Council is really cool because it's going to the Supreme Court. But there's another one that's practically, I think, more important at the moment. And that's a case that was brought by the California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And remember how I said that there's sort of two parts to the law. There is the requirement for producers within the state, and then there's the requirement for products that are sold within the state. This focuses on the second part. The Chamber of Commerce is saying that the retailers, so the grocery stores, are not able to, they have no way of knowing what products are and are not acceptable under Prop 12. The reason for that is because the Department of Ag hasn't finalized the regulations about what Prop 12 is going to mean nuts and bolts in practice. So what they did was they filed a case and they asked for a freeze on enforcement of Prop 12 issues until these regulations are finalized, until they're able to look at the regulations and say, this is what I can do and this is what I can't do. And then we're moving forward after that. And the court agreed with them. They ruled that the agency has to finalize the regulations, and then 100 days after that is the first time that they can begin enforcement of Prop 12. And this is important because Prop 12 was supposed to go into effect for pork and veal in January of this year. So January of 2022 is when the original date was, but it's on hold until those regulations are finalized. It's important to note that California did appeal this, and it is pending in the state appeals court. However, that freeze is still in effect. And so practically speaking, that's the one that's important right now. That's the reason that these regulations or that this ballot proposal is not in effect, is because of this Chamber of Commerce challenge to it.
Okay, fascinating. That's really, really interesting. And I wonder what the status is at the state level and getting those regulations in place. So what the estimated timeline is. Have you heard anything about that?
It's one of those sort of constantly shifting ones. I have not heard the most recent one, but they had expected to have it in place, I think, before it actually went into effect. And so I'm not sure where they're at right now.
Yeah, but
or what
you're
they're
right.
expecting.
What a mess this all is. So talk to me, Beth, about what other states, if any, have similar propositions.
Well, there's quite a few states that have similar laws in effect. I think that probably the other one that's an issue right now, or other one that we're really looking at, is the one that's been passed in Massachusetts that has very similar language or similar framing to Prop 12 in California. Now, that doesn't get a ton of press. It doesn't really get the focus on it because the market share in the state of Massachusetts is obviously going to be less than it is in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
But the way the supply chain works in the retailers in the area around Massachusetts are asking for products that are compliant with the Massachusetts requirements. And so that obviously expands that market share because they want to be able to sell the products in the state of Massachusetts or around, depending on where they're needed to be sold.
So for our listeners who are probably like, wow, this is a lot, but how does this affect me specifically if they are not in one of these states? And what would you tell them?
Well, if you're a producer, these types of laws affect your practices if you want to take advantage of different markets. If you are a consumer, then these affect your purchase price, because if you have, I think all of the economists agree that, different production methods have different costs associated with them, and free range or cage free type living situations have a higher production cost, which means higher prices in the grocery store for consumers. Obviously, I'm not an economist, so that's as in-depth as I'm going to be in terms of the science or economics behind it. But if you have all of these producers that are switching to this other production method with a higher cost associated with it, that's going to have subsequent effects across the country in any place where those eggs are sold or that meat products are sold.
Is it fair to say, Beth, that in the last 5 or 10 years that we've seen a big increase in the number of states that have these types of laws?
Yeah. And Carrie, I don't know about you, but in law school, our property law book was, the thing was ancient to start with, but we learned about laws from like the 1600s because property law doesn't change. And so that, I think, is another one of the reasons that I just find these laws so fascinating, is because within the last 15 years, this idea of what you can do with your property, these animals, has significantly changed in so many of these states. And so, yeah, it's just definitely within the past 15 years, you can just see it move up. In fact, the first one wasn't passed until 2002. And so since then, the last 20 years, we've seen all of these states sort of jump on that bandwagon.
So for our listeners that are wanting specific information, legal information about their operation in their state, what advice would you give to them about finding the right attorney to answer those questions?
If they are looking for just sort of information about what their requirements are, I would reach out first to their Department of Agriculture. And if they are in a state that has this type of laws, then the Department of Ag will have regulations on how to implement it. If they are concerned about that implementation to the point that they need an attorney, there are a couple different paths that I would suggest. The first would be to look and see if your state bar association has an agricultural law section. That would put you in touch with folks who practice agricultural law in that state. There's also a group called the American Agricultural Law Association. And if you Google that name, and you'll go to their website. At the very bottom of the website, they have a membership list that you can click on and find folks that are interested in ag law, maybe hopefully practice ag law, or associated with it in some way within your state. And then finally, don't discount the power of Google. If you type in ag law and Nebraska into Google, hopefully you can find other attorneys that are interested in that area.
So Beth, would you share with our listeners how to contact you or the National Ag Law Center at all if they're interested in more information?
Yeah, so the best way to, you can visit our website, which is nationalaglawcenter.org. And my specific contact information is eRumley, that's E-R-U-M as in Mary, L-E-Y, at uark.edu. And If you have a question, you're welcome to send it to me. I'm happy to answer it. It's important to note, though, that I can't give legal advice. And so I don't represent folks. That's just not what I do. Instead, we give information very similar to the way that cooperative extension does. We just give information, and then folks can take it and approach the other professionals in their area that would be of more help to them.
Well, thank you, Beth, for coming back to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Carrie.